Shoma sells seashells by the seashore. The shells she sells are seashells, I'm sure. So if she sells seashells on the seashore, then I'm sure she sells seashore shells. Oh my God. A very warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for sharing your afternoon with us for our 65th presentation, Seashells. The Nourishment Projects is about joyous curiosity and being part of something much larger than ourselves. Here are some of the references that inform this presentation. So though this presentation's perspectives apply to an ocean, the title applies to bodies of water called sea. So it behooves us to know, what is a sea? A sea is a portion of the ocean that is partly surrounded by land. And so by that definition, there are about 50 seas around the world, including bodies of water that are not always thought of as seas, such as the Gulf of Mexico or the Hudson Bay. And to confuse the matter even more, sometimes a sea is completely landlocked. An example is the Caspian Sea that is shown, which lies between Russia and Iran. It is also referred to as the world's largest lake. Another sea surrounded by land is the Aral Sea. These satellite images, taken between 2000 and 2013, show the final stages of the Aral Sea's drainage. The Aral Sea became the victim of the Soviet Union's agricultural policies in the 1950s. So water from its main two river sources, which is the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya, was intentionally diverted for cotton cultivation. Camels grazing near grounded fishing ships alerts one that there used to be water here. Isn't that surreal to see? But in a small amount of good news, parts of the north section of the Aral Sea are showing improvements. They're trying to take care and do better water management. So that seems to be improving. Another sea surrounded by land is the Dead Sea. And because it contains salt water, it has been called as a sea for many years. But many oceanographers and geographers are more inclined to call the Dead Sea and the Aral Sea as lakes. The super salty Dead Sea isn't gone yet. However, it is shrinking at an alarming rate. Water levels have dropped more than 3 feet each year for the last several years. And as a result, thousands of sinkholes have appeared, signaling a looming water shortage. That's going to be a crisis in that region. South Pacific Solomon Archipelago that borders the Solomon Sea. And so the Commonwealth of Bahamas is an archipelago of more than 700 islands. One theory is that the name was derived from the Spanish Baja Mar. Mar is the sea, so it stands for the shallow sea, for the shallow, bewitchingly limpid waters around the islands. These islands are at risk due to sea level rising. Last month's presentation, Cartography, hopefully established how a successful mapping of the sea was critical historically from the 17th, 18th, late 16th century for commerce, which is trade, proselytization, and colonization. However, not everyone needed maps. For example, people in areas now known as the French Polynesia, areas like Tahiti, Papeete, Bora Bora, all those regions. Before Europeans showed up, the indigenous people of those regions navigated these waters without maps or those mechanical compasses. They steered by the stars. They read the sun and the swells of the water. They used the presence of the birds and the color, brightness, and shapes of clouds to determine their proximity to nearby islands. It is a very different orientation viewpoint from the continental gaze that we are accustomed to. Islanders don't view themselves as outliers from the continents, though. They have a sense of community within the atolls, all that archipelago. It's an ecological vision of relationships. So their relationships definition embraces many more than what we are used to. So that relationality, the connected sense among the islands, they keep that while attending to the differences among the various islands themselves. And this connection, the ecological vision of relation, decenters the human. That sense of relationship, which to me is kinship, embraces the land, the animals, which include humans, the sky, and definitely the sea. Today's story pivots on this sense of interconnection, to trust and lovingly surrender to the other, knowing that in surrendering comes an expansion of the self. The chambers of the proverbial nautilus of life grows because they are connected. They build upon one another. We are all connected. That is the central message. Because as above, so below, because to understand this vastness, trust in nature, in the creation's message is important. And the message is that the essence of the whole is represented in every part, that the small serves as the image of the larger. Perspectives allow for the greater understanding, because in honesty, I think this picture was so appropriate. To study the sun by directly looking into it with the telescope would not only blind us, it would overwhelm us. But look, it's perfectly captured, that vast star, perfectly captured in a dewdrop. Perspectives is important. So seashells, the latter term, is the medium through which we will approach the former, because she has always beckoned us. We are all creatures of the sea. Our lime-hardened skeletons are a heritage of the calcium-rich ocean of the Cambrian times. Each of us carry in our veins a salty stream in which the elements of sodium, potassium, and calcium are combined in almost the same proportion as seawater. The human embryo has gill slits, which eventually develop into the inner ear. Each of us, we must not forget, began in the miniature ocean within our mother's womb. So with that in mind, this movie title, The Sea Inside, should resonate with the messages that are coming off, hopefully to you from what I'm trying to narrate, because this is true in so many levels. The waves of emotion that surge through us, that is like a sea. Intense emotions such as longing, where it feels like the entire ocean crashes on the shore. Surrendering in those emotions, in the faith that no, not to worry, all is definitely not lost. This was, by the way, a very interesting movie. I liked it. It could almost have been a play, although the stage would have been soaked all day long. Another great movie where the sea is a principal character is The Life of Pi. It's a beautifully photographed movie, and the sea is set as a metaphor for life. And there's a magnificent scene in there about bioluminescence. I remember that vividly. A very fun movie. All creatures, great, small, and unreal. I mean, this movie makes the sea life come alive. And again, just like in this one, CGI, computer-generated imagery, makes the whale of this movie awe-inspiring. It's like the all-seeing eye. Call me omniscience. Look at that. A Surge from the Depth, A Little Mermaid, both as a movie or as a ballet. I think it works brilliantly as a ballet because a dance is so appropriate for this story, because the undulation of the sea is a realm of dance, isn't it? It just captures that form. The medium water captures dance so well. The sea looms in the backdrop of Wagner's opera, The Flying Dutchman, and also in the whopper of an opera, Peter Grimes, which is really about ostracization. In the opera, a boy drowns during a storm at sea, and Benjamin Britten, the composer's music, constantly invites both compassion and concern. Bizet's opera, The Pearl Fisher, was set in ancient Ceylon with villagers living by the sea. And in this opera, and in some other ones, the sea really is a fourth character, a primal force who condemns desecration of the Holy Temple by a violent sea storm. And from The Pearl Fisher, speaking of the pearls, a bewitchingly illustrated book about undersea beauties. Though I have to admit, the illustrations are far superior to the story that is written. But when it's Edmund Dulac, it's the one rare time that I care more about pictures than the words. Kingdom of the Sea. It's beautiful to look at. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, a book equally known for the movie's Clapping Seal. I thought it was Kirk Douglas, right, who was in there. It's one of the first movies I saw in India growing up, that and Lady and the Tramp. And there was a character in there, Captain Nemo, who would probably lead the environmental movement of nowadays. Honestly, I love the look and smell of old books, along with illustrations. And when the pages are foxed and you can smell that smell of waiting, perfect. This might surprise you. The most commercially successful book that Edgar Allan Poe had ever put in print in his entire lifetime was on seashells. This really surprised me. I couldn't find the book. I didn't have time to go order it and read it, but that was something to discover. And this is no macabre mystery, you know. He was almost, it's very odd. He was almost called that he had plagiarized. It wasn't true, but he had that ominous title hanging over him for a while, because the Book of Shells is very, very far from the Gothic genre usually associated with Edgar Allan Poe. A fluid writer in so many ways. Rachel Carson's The Sea Around Us. She deserves every admiration and accolade she deserves every bit of it. From books and movies to the world of music, George Crumb's Vox Maloné was inspired by recordings the composer had heard of humpback whales. The evocative, haunting nature of his music draws one in, as does his hypnotically rendered scores. I think they are pure artwork, brilliantly executed. The sound of the sea, it is very, very distinct. The crashing of of the waves, the crying of the seagulls. Now, if you apply that to an extrasensory gastronomical experience, conch shells sprouting earbuds that announce the advent of an extraordinary dish called Sounds of the Sea by Heston Blumenthal in his restaurant near London, in Bray, the Fat Duck. It isn't accidental that it's not called Flavors of the Sea, but the Sound of the Sea. You are served what looks like a sandy bank hugged by a frothy surf, where oysters and razor clams have washed ashore, along with colorful tendrils of seaweed. I have to tell you, Heston Blumenthal blows my mind. That man's imagination is on a different plane. His mind lives where the sky ends. The things that he comes up with, just his website, staggeringly imaginative. So this culinary beach is presented on a glass-topped wooden box containing sand and seashells. But in reality, what looks like sand in the meal is a mixture of tapioca powder, fried breadcrumbs, crushed fried baby eels, cod liver oil, and lobster oil topped with abalone, razor clams, shrimps and oysters, 3 kinds of edible seaweed to boot. Then you're invited to pop in your earbuds, included for the sound of the waves crashing and those seagulls flying around. Imagine they're flying overhead without making swoops at your food. It's like reliving a picnic on the beach. And that's what I found most extraordinary. To make memory, to make nostalgia, a key ingredient of a meal. Amazing. So really, where do we go from such a subtle, beautiful concept? And it's only been 15 minutes into the presentation. We have about 45 minutes left. Where do we go after such an experience? Well, beauty is always a guidepost for me. So we will go to another thing of beauty, which also involves foam. Sandro Botticelli's The Birth of Venus, where the goddess of love herself is riding out of the sea foam on a clamshell, moved by the breath of passion by the zephyrs who are perfuming the sea with roses. Now, the sea foam from which the goddess emerges matters deeply in this story, because the foam of the sea from which the heavenly Venus, who was also known as Aphrodite, arose, was produced by the castration of the god Uranus and his testicles falling into the waters of the sea. Bet you didn't know that, or at least everyone probably didn't know that. So one of the allegories for the painting is death and destruction restored into life and rebirth. Uranus's sacrificial agony of castration, which is the real birth of Venus, that is her origin story, is one of those moments of prohibited fables not readily shared for high school or even middle school students in their mythology class. They edit a bunch of this stuff. Homeric hymns do the same. So, for example, in Politian's hymns, translations, he entirely blots out the initial horror of the entire castration and the testicles falling out of the sea by simply the phrase, "the sky rejoiced." I beg to differ. And then he goes on to say that Uranus takes pleasure in finding himself incarnated in his newborn daughter, saying, and I quote, and these are translations, "In thee I am well pleased." We're going to run with that narration. Regardless, this painting of cosmogonic myth shows the sea being fertilized, I'll point, by the sky, this mystical rain of roses from the breath of the wind god Zephyr. The poetic afterimage of spirit moving over the white, foamy waters, the sea. The goddess's own posture expresses the sensual nature of love. It is both sensuous and chaste, because she does cover. This again is based on an older statue yet, a Medici statue that was found. And it's also behooves us to remember this painting had an accompanying painting by Botticelli, which was Botticelli's Primavera, where Venus now is dressed, Venus's cloak, the flowered mantle of spring, the Primavera of the title. This perceived beauty on earth, what the painting is saying, if you ignore all the signs of the Medicis and their oranges, what the painting is trying to say is that this Primavera, the spring, this perceived beauty on earth is but a veil behind which the splendor of pure celestial beauty is concealed. Here is the pure celestial beauty, untouched. This is the last time one sees Venus naked. The moment she steps on land, she's covered up. You know, it amazes me that, though rarely mentioned in art classes now, the Renaissance viewers would connect this pagan inspired narrative, because this is all pagan imagery, to the baptism of Christ. Because remember, there are times when these are being painted. Isn't that something? This is again the last time this heavenly beauty remains untouched. Her transition from foam onto solid land is brought about by the clam, a sea shell. Easily recognizable, this iconic shell is an example of marine mollusk, and it is born of the sea as well, just as the mythical Venus. You know, vastness in the small things, or as they say, God is in the details. It does matter. Marine mollusks make their shells with minerals from the sea. So this, to say that it comes from the sea, is true in every level. Seashells aren't rocks or stones. They are things that are made with living creatures on their homes. Really, I mean, look at them. They are made by mollusks, and these beautiful exteriors are made by a living creature. Someone lived inside these shells, be they clams or sea snails, or even land ones. All these shells are homes. So look, isn't that sweet? This is the mollusk retreating into the clam, returning home. So let's look at some of these homes, seashells, starting with the Empire State Building. Yup. Also, the Pentagon. Both these buildings are made of limestones. The limestones for the Empire State Building are from the quarries in Indiana. Now, you might wonder, what has this got to do with seashells? Actually, everything. Because limestones are the ancient shells that have been compressed over millennia. Hundreds of millions of years ago, all this area was covered in water. The fossils of those sea creatures is limestone. Those seashell homes now house us. Isn't that marvelous? And they house us in so many ways. The limestone aquifers underfoot, for example, the Mahomet Aquifer in East Central Illinois, these aquifers filter our water. For that, thank the seashells. Not only do they filter, they capture the water, they preserve it instead of just running out. Groundwater is purified naturally through soil, sand, rocks, as it passes through the layers of the earth into these aquifers. Aquifers are rarely underground lakes or rivers, as most people imagine. They're just simply not. The vast majority of the groundwater is found between the grains in rocks, soil, and sediment. Part of this is porous limestone, built of pressurized exoskeletons of seashells. So seashells are an example of biomineralization. So the creatures that live inside these shells, the mollusks, take material from the sea to make these shells. And the primary element is calcium carbonate. The tip is where they start, and they add to it over time. And so these living creatures build as they grow, secreting a shell along the edges. Like Venus from that painting, at least the mythology of Venus, the shells emerge from and thanks to the ocean, or in this our narrative, the sea. Again, as above, so below. These mollusks are sea creatures. I mean, these are the shells of them, who, like humans, have uneven growing times. They grow fast as teenagers, and then they slow down as they age. And with age, like in humans, they become more beautiful, more interesting. Trust me, look at this. Beguiling. As they age, they gain something interesting, fascinating to watch. So I like to jokingly call this cosmetic surgery, because obviously this is not how nature made this nautilus shell. But the beauty of the shells have drawn us over millennia. From time immemorial, we've been across all cultures and geography collecting shells. There's evidence of shell collection in the ruins of Pompeii. And obviously this carved shell isn't from Pompeii, but the picture evidences our fascination with shells over ages and culture. One easy example of which is this idea of the Cabinet of Curiosities, Kunstkammers, from the 17th century throughout Europe, at least wealthy Europe, and they were filled with, among other things, seashell beauties. Shown here is the nautilus shell mounted in silver, on the top of which is the figure of Neptune riding horseback. Again, mythologically, Neptune, who's also known as Poseidon, had created horses to impress his potential lover, his sister, Demeter. By the time he had created the horse, he lost interest in her, thank God. since most of this background mythological stuff has been covered in previous presentations, we've been talking about stuff from 65 presentations. So a lot of stuff have been covered, not just the birth of Venus, the story of how horses were created were covered in Equus last year. So I assume a familiarity with these stories with you guys. And so I often I just glide over them. The presentations build as I learn and as I grow. They are layered too, like the Nautilus. So carved and mounted Nautilus shells were among the most sought after Kunstkammer curiosities in European collections. Remember, during these times, global trade is going on because they're coming to Japan, coming to India, all of that, because these shells are not found that much as they are found in the Indo-Pacific. So the really exotic ones are found there. And so trade and exploration, beginning in the late 16th century, fostered a fascination with the exotic, with the rare materials, particularly among the seafaring countries of Europe, including northern Netherlands. The arrival of these rare and often valuable animal and vegetable materials on European shores encouraged the development of artists who made sculptures and objects and everyday wares, incorporating these materials that were to them rare and often new. These beautiful objects that adorn the European galleries, think of them as examples of globalization. Those materials are not, a lot of the materials are not from Europe. So when one sees Renaissance paintings, even the ones by, whoever, even Michelangelo, the blue, the lapis lazuli that provided the ultramarine, that's coming from Afghanistan. Nothing happens in a vacuum. Globalization is not new. And I find all that fascinating. So the 17th century mother of pearl and many other objects beautifying European cultures are connected to the East. This object was made for the Portuguese market, for exportation, and it came from Gujarat, India. Queen Victoria, or Empress Victoria, she was the empress under whose reign colonies expanded for Britain. The Victorians loved seashells. They were acquisitive, putting it mildly. Shells were a very popular medium. One, because they were more affordable than gemstone for use in cameo carving. The myriad cameo subjects included figures and scenes from Greek and Roman history, mythology from there. And these cameos were considered smart jewelry because of the intellectual nature of the subject being carved. Isn't that something? All the things we find out. I never bothered to think that deeply before. I just admired them for the beauty. But I like the lived experience of objects. I'm maturing, people. Gemstone cameos required steel drills and wheels, and they took a long time to make. Plus, gemstones were expensive. Shells were cheaper, even though they were being imported. Carving shells were easier because you could, and shorter time because you use those engraving tools, burin, and only took days to complete. So on the left, one sees a helmet conch shell, and this was often used for cameo. An example of which is this cameo of the 7th US President, Andrew Jackson. And I'm just showing it as an example of the cameo fever that had swept not just through Europe, but parts of the America in the late 18th century. So businessmen like Marcus Samuel of East London cleverly exploited the magic of vastness, depth, distance, and exoticism that shells exuded. He made his fortune selling souvenir objects along the beaches in Brighton. So curio shop tourist items such as glued-on shell boxes, like these jewelry boxes. And though again, I'm skimming wildly, please realize the larger implications of what these lived experience means. Because during that time, Victorian women were largely idled by the Industrial Revolution because they couldn't participate in that. Mr. Samuel put those women to work. And so these objects were called ladies' work, these curios that they created, and they made him a fortune. To get more exotic shells, Mr. Samuel's carefully curated relationships with Japanese merchants. He went to Japan. He and his son traveled to Japan, as did many other European merchants. That is what fuels some of these wood blocks from ukiyo-e. All those people who love Japanese painting or Japanese wood blocks, this is where it's coming from. As supply and demand grew for the exotic, so did Mr. Samuel's small fleet of ships, importing exotic shells to create curios of all sorts. And I like these. These wood blocks really are instructive, aren't they? Look at them. The flag and the Japanese label identifies each country involved in commerce with Japan. So Mr. Samuels is just an example. Lots of businesses started trading with Japan and showed up here. Exchange of cultures, exchange of good, exchange of artistic ability. But my reason for choosing Mr. Samuel is completely different. Then one of these trips, he and his brother realized the importance of the oil trade during a trip back to the Black Sea. And so they switched from shellfish to kerosene and oil. Business skyrocketed. And from that simple curio shop in East London, Mr. Samuel's wealth grew to the extent that it bought him peerage. He became eventually Lord Mayor of London, and he also got to buy, I shouldn't say buy, he became a Viscount. He named his new business on his first love. Guess what it was called? See, once he gets his peerage, guess what he called his business? I think you might know this company. And it's such a brilliant logo, isn't it? It doesn't even need to be named. The family had actually just figured out how to transport oil in tankers instead of the wooden boxes that it used to be transferred in. There might be a slight problem transferring oil in wooden boxes. Both are flammable. And oil also used to be transferred in like these small tin cans. And the Shell company were clever. They painted the tin cans red and gold, red and yellow, so they could be easily seen. But eventually they figured out how to transport oil in these huge oil tankers, and they beat out Rockefeller to get the contracts. That's how they became phenomenally wealthy. Now, Mr. Samuels had been titled Viscount in recognition of the services he provided in supplying fuel for the British Empire during World War I. And with his wealth, his family had invested in a lot of the arts. That's just the way it's a repeat story. But back to the reason why he's part of the story. The original oil tanker that he had was named after a shell, the Murex, and the Shell company keeps that tradition. Many of the ships that are still in use are named after shells. Murex. Here is the beauty after which those ships are named. And there is a huge irony in that this is happening, which I'll get to in a moment. Many Shell oil tankers uphold, like I said, the naming tradition. Vexilla, the tanker, is shown here. And here is her namesake, Seashell. The irony I was referring to earlier is that the Murex seashell, the original tanker, is named after that seashell. That seashell is almost extinct now in the Mediterranean. It used to be quite prolific. Isn't that layers of irony? Oil is a fossil fuel. Emphasis on the word fossil. A fossil is simply the remnant of prehistoric plant or animal. So the rise in global temperature attributed to burning fossil fuel, the subsequent rise in water levels, that is a harbinger for islands like the Bahamas that was shown before, or the Maldives, all of them sinking. Fossil fuel companies are contributing to this devastation. To be decimating the population of that which you are named is ironic, to say the least, and I doubt Mr. Samuel would be pleased. Looking beyond the existential crisis of rising water level on these 1,200 coral islands, if you look beyond that, the Republic of Maldives in the Indian Ocean has a fascinating reason why it's been included in our story of seashells. Way before cryptocurrency, way before, here is the world's first global currency, the gentle algae, I think you call it now, eating mollusk, the money cowrie. There is evidence, I'm going to point now, here are cowrie shells, of cowries being used as currency in India as early as the 4th century CE, CEs being CE current era. Cowries were used in China. This is evidence in documentation throughout. This humble reef animal with its humped shell has a vast story, beautifully diverse. But the one that we are specifically interested in for today is the money cowrie. And it has been used as currency for almost 1,000 years. And one can see why. It's uniform in size, easy to count, packs well in bags, so you can count them as coins. It's lightweight and impossible to counterfeit. Playing the shell game for currency takes a whole new meaning when you're using money cowrie, doesn't it? Though cowries are found in many places and there's a diversity of their look, the money cowries from the Maldives was the chosen one from the ancient times. Why? I suspect location, location, location. Look where they are. From last month's presentation, cartography, please recollect the Periplus, which is the document that listed the posts and the landmarks for the ancient travel routes, especially coming from Italy, the trade routes that went down the Red Sea and picked up stuff from India and took back, right? Now, the Maldives aren't far. They're down here, right? They are the Maldives, aren't far from this marketplace, the Dubai of the ancient times, India. In that context, think of Maldives as the bank, because that's where the money cowrie grew. From being accepted as currency in India, the money cowrie moved west into the Red Sea region and to mainland Southeast Asia and beyond, including Africa. Now, again, Africa had its own cowries, but they used this money cowrie for currency. Though cowrie shells are no longer used as currency in Africa, they still carry an association with money and wealth. For example, in Ghana, the history of the cowrie as currency is honored on a 20 cedi coin. Cowries are obviously evident in Maldivian banknotes. I'm going to point right there. You see the cowries on the side, on the bottom left side of the banknotes for both 5 and 500 currency. So historically, glass beads, cowries, many different items have been accepted as currency. And while I was researching this, I realized wealth is much, 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 much more than paper and coins. I'm not talking about cryptocurrency. During the US Depression in the 30s, shell was accepted as currency in at least a pharmacy in California. Look at that. 50 cents, you get, it's given, it's notarized. You can use it, shell, as payment. And in the rest of the world, including America, this is a Edward Curtis photograph. She's wearing, it's a portable wealth. She's wearing her belt, be it in America or Africa. Again, wealth is more than paper and coins. And the most easy definition is access and networks. That is all wealth. And it applies because part of the triangle trade, a dubious trade, a third of the enslaved Africans forced to America were bought with cowrie shells. So though the European traders would not accept cowries as payment, they traded cowries for goods such as cotton, cloth, and ivory. And this is again, West Africa. I know it's a very simple sentence I made, but these simple sentences deserve deliberation. Go down those rabbit holes. Because look, the West Africans didn't trust European monetary values. They were familiar with cowries and it couldn't be counterfeit, so they accepted that. But the larger picture question is, previously, people lived from things they made. Transitions from cowries to paper and to other currencies pushes the conversation from the realms of, knowledge and manufacturing economy, where you can make these things, into a market economy, regulated currencies and things. It's a very different conversation and has many, many implications, lots of lived experiences. That is not part of the story today, but I just wanted to point it out. And that goes both ways. Again, wealth is more than just paper coins. You may remember most people are more aware of tulip mania in Netherlands because speculation on tulips. That wasn't the only speculation going on at the same time. They speculated on seashells as well because Dutch were traders. Exotic shells drove them mad. And let me show you how much. Newly discovered specimens were especially prized, and wealthy collectors often celebrated their prosperity because then, as now, you want to show off what you have, God knows why. They did these in those cabinet of curiosities, for example, the Kunstkammer and Wunderkammers, and in their plans to show exotic plants. That's why orchids was such a craze. And also still life paintings, because often these were commissioned, and these were popular throughout 17th century Holland. One painting is shown here, and I'm going to point, there's the cowries right there. So this is not mere painting, it's signifying that whoever commissioned the painting had these things. Because look, and you'll see them in the museums. And this venomous beauty of a sea cone is the only known shell species to have been stolen from a museum. Let's see why. So in the late 18th century, one shell of this glory of the sea seashell could sell for more than 250 florins. So florins or guilders was the currency in Netherlands. So this is the late 18th century, or this is the 18th century. In 1791, this Vermeer had sold for 41 guilders. Keep in mind, this tiny thing sold for 250 guilders or florins. 41 florins. The shell cost more than 6 times the price of that Vermeer painting. In context of that, the recent Vermeer exhibition at the Amsterdam makes you wonder, who determines who or what is of value? This idea of value is such a shell game. Shells are instructive about humanities in so many ways. And there were so many ways to approach the story of seashells. Inspiration, scores by George Crumb. I mean, look at that, beautiful thing, spiral galaxy indeed. Again, as above, so below. As above in the cosmos, look at the shape. So below in the deep ocean, and everything in between. Inspired stone stairs. Just look. Isn't that something? This is an ammonite. At first, when I saw it up close, it looked just like the stairs. More than just spiral stairs, seashells have inspired architects such as Frank Gehry, Gaudi, many other architects, Utzon, who the architect for the Sydney Opera House, who is very well known. He was inspired by seashells. And isn't it appropriate? This opera house is next to the water, just where a seashell would belong. Now, how else could the story have gone? Fossils of marine life, which have been found on mountaintops, evidence that these high altitudes were once covered under an ocean. So shells, the story could have been about extinction. This sample of a shell isn't being merely shown here for its undeniable beauty. So this gastropod, and a gastropod is a class of mollusks. This gastropod is called the lightning whelk. Most gastropods are right-handed. And if you look, these are left-handed. The shells open to the left. Once in a while, a rare case, you will see a lightning whelk that is right-handed. It's very rare, but it does happen. So its value would be phenomenal if they found this in the 16th, 17th century. The one we see on the right is important to see because most other shells do open on the right, not the lightning whelk. One theory provided for why this was a left side opening. And remember, this is the opening through which the animal, the mollusk, enters and exits the home and feels safe from predators. One reason for this not anomaly, this difference in design is attributed to evolutionary requirement for defense. So the mollusks who lived in the lightning whelk apparently had in theory, a strong left-handed crab as its predator. And so it opened on this side because these things are landing down like this. So the crab had trouble getting to the mollusk. It's just a theory. And this theory has exceptions around the world because there are many other crabs that exist near these lightning wells, other parts of the world, that are not left-handed strong. But the reason for my including this is the evolutionary biologist who espouses that theory. Professor Hirat Verma from UC Davis. Why do I care? And I think you will too. And you see how this mollusk opens to the right. Professor Verma, he is blind. When in 4th grade, his teacher in New Jersey had brought back a trove of seashells from a trip and had, displayed them in a class. Hirat, he saw with his hands because he was blind. And as he held the shells, he perceived beauty. As research for these presentations, I watch interviews and I was riveted that at the age of 9 or 10, this man, then a child, had perceived beauty that moved him enough to devote his entire life to the study of these creatures, to go and get a PhD from Yale in this, to sense the beauty of a material, not just the visuals. So he sensed spiritual beauty. I was struck by that because that spiritual beauty also drove the Native Americans to revere the lightning whelk. Objects made from lightning whelk have been found in the Cahokia Mounds just south of Illinois, which is in Missouri. St. Louis, as we all know, is in the Midwest, not near the sea. That means the Native Americans spiritually treasured lightning whelks enough to trade for it from far away. Lightning whelks are found in Florida, not the Midwest. They're found not in the rivers, in the shallow seas and in the seas. The more curious one becomes, the more meaning is discovered. I love curiosity. So seashells, again, are homes created by mollusks with materials they find in the sea. So primarily, that is calcium carbonate. And so by upcycling calcium carbonates, these mollusks help reduce the carbon dioxide levels released into the atmosphere because carbon dioxide has carbon as part of its compound. So the fossil fuel that we consume, the oil, emphasis again on the word fossil, is made of extinct life from millions of years ago. And so in the large view of eternity, to say that we're running out of fossil fuel is entirely false. Because if you give it millions of years, all that fossil fuel will come back, probably made of us. So the time frame matters. But in part of this story is the limestone aquifers, which help retain and filter our water, thank the seashells, because limestone help not only give us the water and parts of the buildings that we admire, they have created sculptures of art, limestone statues. Limestones, again, are pressurized fossils. We are surrounded by seashells and her avatars. By consuming carbon, shells, because they are taking the carbon from the water, shells contribute to the balance of our ecosystem, ensuring that the atmosphere that we live in allows us to breathe, to have a balance in CO2 levels, as does the trees. Everything works. Again, principal message, interconnectedness. The larger idea of kinship. Seashells have survived 5 mass extinctions, but let's not test a 6th. We consume conchs. Desire for exotic shells, even now, are decimating ecosystems. But just because these shells don't have eyes that stare back at us pleadingly, so like beautiful little creatures, cute creatures do looking back at us, they have great PR teams. We are not readily aware that the mollusks have a precarious position. The chambered nautilus is endangered, which is horrifying to think because the chambered nautilus is a nocturnal creature. They only come out of their depths at night, and yet they're endangered. How much do we overfish these things? And I wonder if the poet Oliver Wendell Holmes knew the real ominous implications of the lines from his poem, some of which is like, wrecked is this ship of pearls. It is a ship of pearls. It is wrecked. Its iris ceiling rent. Yup. Its sunless crypt unsealed. You pop them open. As we come to a close, here is one of the most recognized artworks about the sea. It's called Under the Wave of the Kanagawa, and this woodblock print is part of the Japanese artist Hokusai's series, 36 Views of Mount Fuji. So you see Mount Fuji. Hokusai was enamored with that mountain. There's a story on which the fable that he lived by, they made a movie on that fable, The Princess of Kaguya, but that's what this series is about. Now, Under the Wave of Kanagawa has inspired other great European artists like an Edmund Dulac. You see, again, we are all connected. One inspires the other. But to me, there is a higher inspiration than cultural. I glean a message from the boat of fishermen in this woodblock. I'm pointing to them now. They are the fishermen down there, bowed down. When encountering a wave, say a wave of emotion, an emotion again is an energy in motion. So be that energy love or anger. What I learned, it's best to submit to it, surrender, to let it ride over me if it's anger, because it's futile to fight this, to fight with the other. It's best to conquer anger with peaceful, courageous submission. That's what I get from this. And if the wave of emotions is love, to have the courage to surrender to it, to surrender my ego and be rewarded by being engulfed by passion. That's what my 50 years have taught me, to lovingly acknowledge and let go, layer by layer, beliefs and people that no longer resonate, by finding the courage within me to keep on growing. Build thee more stately mansions, O my soul, as the swift seasons roll. Leave thy lowly vaulted past. Let each temple, nobler than the last, shut thee from heaven with a dome more vast, till thou at length art free, leaving thine outgrown shell by life's unresting sea. Thank you for your time. I'm always grateful that you choose to spend time with us, and I wish you joy.